Good morning, everyone. Welcome to episode 4. I have a day off today, so I thought it would be perfect to just start my day by filming the episode. So today I'm going to talk about a writer that I admire very much. Not only do I admire Stephen King as a writer, but as a person as well. I think he's a very interesting person, and he's someone who I can spend hours listening to. I think he's very entertaining, he's very smart, and he's just altogether very interesting. Stephen King is also known as America's most beloved boogeyman. That's in his own words, by the way. Okay, so we start with the early life. Stephen King's childhood. Stephen King was born in 1947 in Portland, Maine. His childhood was not very easy. His father left when he was only a kid. Apparently, he left to get cigarettes and he never came back. It was just him, his brother, and his mother, and they were moving frequently. They never had a stable life. And you will discover if you read Stephen King's books that this sense of instability and being on the margins never left his work. Those topics are very present in his stories. Ever since he was a child, Stephen King was always a reader. He loved books. When he was a child in rural Maine, there was this very big bus that would come once a year during the summer. It was called the Bookmobile. It was essentially a library on wheels. It was a huge green bus that was filled with books. It drove to small towns and neighborhoods. It had a lot of newly released books and bestsellers. As a kid, Stephen King didn't have access to bookstores or a big home library. Money was tight, transportation was limited. So books were not something that you could easily access in his case. So this is why this bookmobile was like a lifeline to Stephen King. And it was there for people who otherwise had no access to books. So to young Stephen King, it was this very important event during the summer. And he would wait for this bookmobile just like other kids would wait for the ice cream truck. And the way he would wait for this event, the way he would wait for books, it was very important because it showed that reading was not something casual to him. It was something that was very much desired. Books were not just background noise or just a pastime. They were treasures. Stories felt very scarce. They were very valuable and they were alive. As an adult, Stephen King and his whole family, they had a lot of respect for libraries because they knew what it was like to grow up poor, not to be able to buy books whenever you want or whatever book you want. Libraries were accessible. This is why as an adult, he donated a lot to libraries and he supported them. When you come from poverty, you understand its value. Now I'm going to tell you about the moment horror stories entered his life. Young Stephen King found a box of his father's old books in the attic. And inside were stories by H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, pulp fiction horror, science fiction horror, and just cheap sci-fi magazines. You know, a bunch of lowbrow content. This discovery that he made, it felt very forbidden. And this knowledge that he acquired from this content felt very dark, very dangerous, very thrilling. Stephen King explained that horror gave a shape to the anxieties he's always felt but could never name. In other words, he says that horror did not create his fears, it gave them a form. He says that he never felt shame from loving this trash, as he calls it, because his family struggled financially, so those cheap paperbacks were available, they were accessible, and they were affordable. Stephen King is a type of person who, even as a child, he would read whatever he could get his hands on. Books to him were not culture, they were more of escape hatches. So as a kid, he didn't read to get more educated. He just read to survive boredom and the sense of instability that he had in his life. Instead of aspiring to literary respectability, he learned that story comes first, pleasure matters, and fear is a valid aesthetic. And as he grew older, reading became an apprenticeship. He started paying attention to how stories worked. He noticed pacing, cliffhangers, and endings. He also learned what bored him personally, and he avoided it. And then at a certain point, Stephen King started writing his own stories. However, the early days of writing, it was more copying than creating. For example, he rewrote monster stories in his own words. He also created a homemade newspaper that his mother would read. He also sold stories to classmates for a few bucks. You could say his mother was his first reader and his first critic as well. She never discouraged his writing. In fact, she very much encouraged it. And I love the fact that she treated his writing as real work, and her validation mattered enormously. Very early on in his life, Stephen King understood the importance of books. As a young kid, books were his friends, his teachers, and of course, a safe space. They were a trustworthy emotional companionship. His lifelong belief was that books were not luxury, they were a necessity. That's why Stephen King says he writes for ordinary people, he writes for everyone, he respects genre, and he never talks down his readers. Writing was very much a passion of his, and Stephen King says that books saved his life as a kid, and then he spent the rest of his life returning the favor. Now I'm gonna tell you about Stephen King's university days and his first official writing attempts, as in writing and trying to publish. Stephen King studied English at the University of Maine, and while he was studying, he was writing constantly. He loved writing, he loved the actual act of composition. He would use this old typewriter that he had, and he started trying to send his stories to local magazines. However, this first period of attempting to publish his stories to magazines was not easy at all. He collected dozens and eventually hundreds of rejection slips. But what he literally did was he pounded a nail in front of his desk, and he would attach those rejection slips on the nail. And when he was 18, 19 years old, the papers started falling off the nail. The nail itself started bending. So what he did was he got a bigger nail. Stephen King always jokingly says that if you don't succeed, just get a bigger nail. That is his secret to success. But then eventually he started selling stories to magazines. So the key thing in this whole story is that, and this is something that I admire very much about him, is his persistence. So rejection did not slow him down. It actually normalized failure to him. King himself says that writing is not magic. It's hard work. He married young. He was still a university student, and he had children young. His wife, Tabitha Spruce, is also a writer. Their partnership was very special, and it mattered a lot to him, emotionally, creatively, and in many other aspects of his life. His post-marriage time was also a tough time. It was not easy at all. After college, Stephen King worked at a laundromat, a laundry place, and he would wash hotel sheets. And in parallel to that, he also taught in high school. He taught English. He, his wife, and their kids lived in a trailer. It was a very, very tiny, uncomfortable place. They very much struggled to support a growing family. Stephen King kept selling his short stories to men's magazines. And with this small amount of money that he would receive, it helped, pay the bills and afford at least medication for the kids, or as he would call it, the pink stuff. So at this point of his life, writing was more survival than pleasure, or, doing it just because he loves to do it. He literally wrote in the laundry room while he was working. He wrote literally at any scrap of time he could steal. So with the laundromat job, with the teaching, those small, $200, $300 checks that he would receive from his writing, they came in handy. It meant that he could support his family full time. Now, in 1974, there was a turning point, and that was when Stephen King published his novel, Carrie. Now, when Stephen King started writing Carrie, it was inspired by his own memories of being bullied and a story of two girls he knew who had suffered terribly in their lives, and his interest in telekinesis. In case you don't know what telekinesis is, it's this ability to move objects with your mind. However, Stephen King hated the book when he was writing it. It was very frustrating to him. He literally threw the manuscript in the bin. But his wife Tabitha saved it. She took it from the bin, and she told him, "You should continue working on this book. I feel strongly about it." She read it and she liked it. The problem is that Stephen King was struggling with the female perspective in the story. He didn't know how to write about women. So his wife Tabitha, she raised her hand and she said, "I will help you." And she did. And she helped him finish the book. The book sold for $400,000 and Stephen King's share was $200,000. So at that time, he was able to quit teaching. Now, this sudden fame that Stephen King had after selling Carrie and other successful novels, it came at a price because a tougher time followed. It was that period of time between the 1970s and 1980s. During that period of time, Stephen King sold very successful novels like Salem's Lot, It, The Stand, and The Shining. However, success brought with it alcohol and drug addictions. Stephen King says that he felt this crushing pressure to produce. This is what usually happens after fame and success. He started having this fear of losing his talent and recycling old ideas. It's a fear that never left him, by the way. However, even at his lowest, and despite this fear, he never stopped writing. Never. His discipline, it stayed intact. Now, after that very tough period of depression and struggling with addiction, came a time of recovery and reinvention. In the late 80s, Stephen King's family, they staged an intervention. His wife Tabitha and their very close family members and very close friends, they actually confronted him together rather than individually. What they did was to present physical evidence of his addiction: beer cans, liquor bottles, drug paraphernalia, even his tissue stained with blood from, sniffing coke damage. All the members who gathered, each one of them, they started describing how his drinking and his drug use was affecting their lives personally. They started explaining yet again how his behavior was affecting his life and putting it at risk. They made it very clear, especially his wife, that this was the last line moment, and that if he didn't seek help, that they would no longer be able to protect him or support him. Stephen King's reaction at first was, of course, being defensive and getting angry, but he later said that this intervention that his family and friends did, it terrified him more than any story he's ever written. So eventually he realized that if he didn't seek help, if he didn't change his behavior and his way of life, he's going to literally lose his family. The intervention had a successful outcome. Stephen King entered recovery. He quit drinking, he quit using drugs, and he's been sober since 1987 or 88. He spoke openly about this phase of his life in his memoir on writing, and he even admits that he does not remember the process of writing some of his novels due to his addiction. For example, he doesn't remember how he wrote Cujo, which was the novel he wrote about a mad dog or something. Now I'm gonna tell you why getting sober actually matters a lot. Not only did it, of course, save his life, but it also changed his writing. Some of his later works, they deal with addiction, recovery, self-awareness. There was also another important event in Stephen King's life, and that is his near-death experience. In 1999, Stephen King was hit with a van when he was out walking, and he nearly died. He was in so much pain, it hurt to even stand up or sit or even concentrate. He was very dependent on pain medication throughout this whole period. At first, sitting down and writing for a few minutes was literally impossible to him. His wife helped him physically to be able to write again because he literally considered giving up on the whole thing. He rebuilt his writing setup because Stephen King has a very specific writing setup. So she had to rethink it and to make it more, tolerable to him. His writing sessions were kept very short, sometimes literally just a few minutes at a time. The focus was more on comfort and endurance rather than, productivity. His wife encouraged him to take it one step at a time. She did not want him to give up on writing, as painful as it was. She wanted him to use writing as a means to recover. She wanted it to be therapy. All she wanted to do was just to protect his focus and give him the right environment so that he can feel safe again, feel comfortable again, and able to focus and produce. Okay, so that was very briefly about Stephen King's life. And now I'm gonna talk about the literary genre to which his books belong. When Stephen King is asked about the type of books that he writes, he says that if you were to ask the ordinary reader, they would say that I write horror stories. But what he believes is that he writes suspense novels. Stephen King is usually labeled as a horror writer. But, and It's something that he always tries to explain. It's the least interesting way to describe what he writes. The better answer would be that Stephen King writes genre fiction that uses horror as a lens to explore real human problems. So you can think of his writing as sitting at an intersection between horror, social realism, and psychological realism. His stories cover themes such as coming of age, childhood, memory, loss of innocence, themes like fantasy and the supernatural. You have psychic powers, parallel universes, cosmic evil, crime and suspense, especially in his later work. So when people say that Stephen King writes horror stories, he himself pushes back and says, I write about people in trouble and that's the key. His stories are horror stories, but they are very much grounded in reality. Horror always comes after something human breaks, like alcoholism, we find that in The Shining, grief in the story Pet Sematary, and childhood trauma in his novel It. So the monstrosity is rarely the starting point. It always starts off as a real human story. Stephen King always writes about ordinary people, ordinary homes, small towns, very normal settings, but at some point something slightly off starts creeping in gradually. This is why his work feels very disturbing, because it's not like he's writing in Gothic towers or, you know, the lair of some vampire or something. It's always in a very ordinary setting, something that can be happening in your neighbor's house next door. Critics are said to struggle with Stephen King's writing genre. He is often excluded from serious literature because he writes a lot. He's a very prolific writer. Even his son jokes about the fact that my dad can literally sneeze and a book can come out. He writes very accessibly. He uses genre tropes. Many scholars now argue that King belongs to American realism, that alongside other writers who examine national anxieties, but he just does it with ghosts and monsters and stuff. So if you were to define his genre briefly and in one sentence, you could say that Stephen King writes about real human conditions, about fear, about trauma and morality, while using horror and the supernatural, but as tools, not as, the whole point of the story. Now I'm going to talk to you about Stephen King's writing style. King uses simple conversational prose. In his stories there are deep interior monologues and a very interesting slow character build-up. His characters are very, very interesting, very important. They say that the scares in his stories, they hook you and his characters keep you. One of my favorite things when it comes to Stephen King's writing style is his honesty. He is very unfiltered. He was once having a discussion with his editor about his novel, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and in the book there's only one F word. He drops one F-bomb. His editor told him that if you agree to remove this word, we would be able to get this novel to junior high libraries. But Stephen King refused. Even in his memoir on writing, there's a fair amount of profanity and vulgarity. He thought to himself that this book will probably not be approved to use in classrooms, to teach writing because of its language. But then he thought that he couldn't care less. Stephen King believes that you don't necessarily become a writer for classrooms. He also believes very strongly that writing can be learned. However, it cannot necessarily be taught. So he said that if you have a book like his memoir on writing, he would rather have a kid take it home with him and just read it whenever he wants before going to bed, rather than having it as part of the curriculum and having it be taught in a classroom. When it comes to writing, Stephen King also believes that writing is a private conversation and not a performance. Writing actually fails if it becomes very performative, very showy, and anxious about reputation. Now, there's a question that Stephen King is asked very often, and that is, where do your stories come from? Where do your ideas come from? His honest answer is that he genuinely doesn't know. He says that this is the unvarnished truth. I don't know, and just like I don't know where the color of my eyes comes from, I don't know where my ideas come from. However, he does give some examples of how an idea can come about. For example, he tells a story of when he was a kid and he started getting very passionate about writing. There was this guy who was the first modern time serial killer. His name was Charlie Starkwater, and that was in Nebraska in the 50s. Stephen King was obsessed with him. He had all these news clippings about Starkwater. He was only 10, and when his mom discovered those newspaper clippings, she was very concerned. He had this picture of him, and he says that I would look at his eyes and I would see nothing, just vacant rooms and depopulated planets. He got so obsessed with him, and he thought to himself, I want to know everything about this guy. I want to know what he is, how he thinks, because I want to learn how to protect myself from someone like him. For example, that was an inspiration to him when he was a kid, when he started writing. Another very interesting example is that when he got older and he became a very famous writer, a girl came up to him once and she told him, I'm your biggest fan. So he started thinking about this sentence a lot. And this was the inspiration for his novel Misery, which was the story of a woman who was obsessed with this writer. So she kidnaps him, she holds him hostage, and she forces him to produce a novel for her. He gives other examples as well. One day, when he was putting his pants on, literally, in the morning, he had this idea come up to him out of nowhere. He thought about a guy who one day has a dream about a body buried in a specific place. And as soon as this guy woke up, he decides to go to this place and try to dig the spot to see if there's actually a body. And he finds one. But instead of having people believe this guy's story that he just randomly found a body, they start having doubts about him, that he might be the reason behind this murder. This was another random idea that he had. And he tells a story of another idea that he had once in an airport, and it was my favorite story that he told. He was at the airport and his wife wanted to go to the restroom, so he was waiting for her outside. And then another guy came along and he waited next to him. His wife wanted to go to the restroom as well. And then a kid was waiting for his mom who wanted to go to the restroom. And while waiting, along with other men, he started thinking, anything could be going on in there. So he thought about the idea of a story entitled The Ladies' Room, where women would go in and they would not come out. And so pretty soon the main character would grab a person who worked at the airport and would ask them to please go inside the ladies' room to see what's going on in there. So that person goes in and would also not come out. At some point, security guards are called, the police, National Guards, and then it's national news. But Stephen King himself could not figure out what the hell was going on in this restroom. And that was it. He could not find a way to complete this idea for a story. He was just very interested in this chain reaction that the story had. So Stephen King says that ideas can come along. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, and sometimes, even though they're challenging, they're very hard to let go of. Now, there's this theory that a novelist talks about. I'm so sorry, I forgot her name, but she believes that writers don't create, they just arrange. And Stephen King says that he disagrees with this statement. He doesn't see himself as an arranger. By the way, I'm so sorry, I don't know if you can hear this, but my cat is literally snoring. He believes that stories are found, that they are found articles, and that stories can tell themselves. And he believes that his job is to get as much of it out, unbroken and undamaged. And I love how he explains that it's very archaeological in that sense, that he sees himself more of an archaeologist rather than a set designer that is just there to arrange things. So everything is already there, you just have to take it out undamaged. Now we're going to talk about Stephen King's writing process. Just like Murakami, Stephen King's writing process can be described as very disciplined. Very disciplined and very stubborn. And that is mainly why it works. King explains that he's not chasing inspiration, he's just building a habit. And he wants to build a habit that is strong enough to last him for days, because writing is a very tedious and a very overwhelming process if you think about it. It's very lengthy. Now I'm going to walk you through the process step by step, and just like Stephen King describes it. Stephen King does not outline his story extensively. He does not have a clear story in his head where he knows that it's going to start like this, and then this is going to happen, and then this is going to be the resolution. Instead, he begins with one question, and that is, what if? For example, what if a girl is bullied at school and then she develops a telekinesis power? Or what if a family is isolated in a haunted hotel? Or what if a fan held hostage her favorite writer? Stephen King believes that plotting too much kills the surprise, not only for the reader, but for the writer as well. So plotting ahead of time, it spoils the book. As he explains it, he literally thinks of it as the last resort for bad writers. In other words, it's like an act of desperation. This is why what is important to him is to first put his characters in difficult situations, and then he will see how it goes. So to sum it up, Stephen King is more interested in characters and in situations. He says that plotting and spontaneity are very incompatible, they're literally polar opposites. And he definitely prefers spontaneity in the writing process. And he once talked about a friend of his who was also a writer. His name is John Herring. And John Herring once told Stephen King that the way he works is that he starts by writing the last line of a book. And to Stephen King, this was horrific. And he says, like, why would you do that? Like, why would you spoil the fun? It's like eating the frosting of a cake, which is the best part. King also doesn't keep a lot of notes. He says that a notebook is a perfect place to immortalize bad ideas for writers. He doesn't like to keep notebooks. To him, the idea of a good idea for a story is the one that sticks around and builds up. So just like a kid would, he would start by telling himself a story, and at some point the idea sticks and it starts developing. Characters are what lead Stephen King's stories. Once the situation is set, King creates characters with fears, flaws, and desires. He lets them react naturally, and the story unfolds from those reactions. This is why his characters feel very much alive, because they're not marching towards a, predetermined ending. Stephen King's daily discipline is non-negotiable. He has to write at least 2,000 words every day with no excuses. He compares writing to training a muscle. You skip one day and it weakens it. The physical setup of the writing process also matters. Stephen King is very specific about the writing environment. The door has to be closed. He has to be sitting on a desk while writing. He never sits on a couch or in bed or anywhere else. No TV, no phone, no internet, no distractions. He believes that physical boundaries, they reinforce mental focus. Later, and once the first draft is done, he can open the door. He always says that the writing process is behind a closed door and the rewrites are with an open door. And he also believes that speed matters more than perfection. First draft that he writes it very fast, momentum over polish, emotion over precision, and no way of stopping for the sake of, fixing sentences. He says that writing is actually a very daunting task if you really think about it. So this is why he tries not to think about it a lot. And he's also the type of person who doubts himself a lot. And if he gives himself this opportunity to start doubting himself, he would not be able to write anything. This is why he works very fast, so that he doesn't have this time to think or to overthink his decisions. Now, after finishing the first draft, there is a cooling off period. Stephen King will put his manuscript away for at least 6 weeks. He will not look at it. He wants to, gain emotional detachment from it. And this would be a very clever way to return to it as a reader rather than its creator. I believe in that too, by the way, even in art. I always tell my students, whenever they're working on something and they spend a lot of time looking at their work and thinking about it, I tell them, leave it for today, take distance from it, and tomorrow you will see it with a fresh eye. You will notice mistakes. You will see it in a very completely different way. Now, he has rules when it comes to manuscript revisions. He says you need to cut 10% off whatever you wrote. Remove anything that is self-indulgent. Kill the unnecessary explanations. Clarity and pace always win. Now, when it comes to feedback, it's very limited and it's chosen very carefully. Stephen King trusts his instincts, so he doesn't want a lot of, opinions when it comes to his work, when it comes to revisions. He believes that too many voices will dilute, the tone, the voice. He has a very small circle of very trusted readers. And of course, his wife Tabitha is his most important critic. Now, when it comes to turning out his manuscript, it's always the hardest thing for Stephen King. I love the way he explains that too. He says that it's like you have a private field and it's full of fresh snow and it's only yours. And turning your manuscript in is very similar to opening your private snow field to the public. And you have all these, footsteps and it's not yours anymore. It's not pure anymore. So when it comes to his writing, the comments are going to start coming in, notes from the editors. So what was his for a very long time is now shared space. It's public. Now when it comes to language and writing, Stephen King has very very clear philosophies. He prioritizes nouns and verbs over adverbs. He hates adverbs, and he made it very clear in his book on writing. He says that the road to hell is paved with adverbs. He believes in using very strong verbs, keeping the vocabulary very natural, not fancy. He really believes that good style in writing is invisible. Now, writing the ending philosophy. Stephen King never forces twist endings. He mostly aims for emotional truth and a logical consequence. He wants a character-driven resolution. So if the ending feels earned, then it's good enough for him. Now, from what I've come to read so far when it comes to Stephen King's novels, I love the way he ends his novels. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like I trust him, and I trust him with an ending that will not hurt me. Now, Stephen King's very valuable advice when it comes to writing. He says that reading is fuel, and it's very reminiscent of Murakami as well. Stephen King is a type of person who reads constantly. He reads anything, fiction, non-fiction, lowbrow, highbrow, any type of literature. He says that reading will recharge your imagination, it sharpens your instincts as a writer, and of course it prevents, creative stagnation. So for him, reading and writing are inseparable. Now, Stephen King also talks about this writing for an ideal reader theory. He says it's very important to write with your ideal reader in mind. This is what you can also call as target audience. Now for him, his ideal reader is his wife Tabitha. When he's working on a book, when he's writing, he imagines one person and one person only, and that is his wife. And the reason is, first of all, she is a writer herself, by the way. So she knows what she's talking about when she's, critiquing writing. But she's also very honest with him. He knows that she's going to tell him the unvarnished truth. She's not there to flatter him. She's there to help him. And if you think about it, the same thing happened as a kid. His ideal reader, I think it was his mother, and she was also very honest with him. So like I said, Tabitha is a writer herself. She's very intellectually sharp. She's very emotionally intelligent. She's very willing to tell her husband that this is not working. For him, writing for Tabitha is like writing for someone who knows him very deeply, and someone who, as he says, sees through his bullshit. And she is someone who, just like him, cares about the truth of the story. So all of that keeps him very honest. And by writing to his wife, Stephen King is able to avoid writing for critics, avoid writing for trends, or, writing to a market. Instead, the tone of the writing becomes very intimate, almost like a confession. In his book on writing, he once described good writing as a form of telepathy between the writer's subconscious and the reader. So it's a direct transmission from mind to mind. I love how much Stephen King trusts his wife, how much her opinion matters to him. What's also even more adorable is the fact that his son, Joe King, he's also a writer. He actually writes under a pen name, Joe Hill, because he didn't want to be famous because his dad is famous. Joe Hill also trusts his mom a lot, and he was once telling a story of him finishing his manuscript, and he knew that he wrote a very bad ending. He knew that the ending was very crappy, and he had in mind what the editors would say, but he thought to himself, I'm not going to change it. No matter who says what, I'm not going to change my ending because I'm an artist and I know what I'm doing. This is my creation. So he gave the manuscript to his mom. She told him, yeah, it's a good book. I like it, but the ending is not good. It won't work. And then he told her, okay, mom, and he changed it. They trust her so much, and it's so sweet. So this emotional safety is very important to him. It's very important to Stephen King in the process of creation, because it also means that he is able to take risks, which is also very important. In other words, because he is able to write to that specific someone who loves him unconditionally, he is able to write about shame, he is able to write about addiction and the pain that comes with it, he's able to write about hurt, he's able to write about losing loved ones. Writing for Tabitha allows him to drop his armor. She is the guarantee that the work will not be cruel and empty. And the deeper philosophy behind writing for your chosen or ideal reader is that, of course, you should not be writing for everyone. You should be writing for someone. This is why in art there's always a target audience. Because in order for something to work, it has to cater to a specific audience needs. So Stephen King's advice to aspiring writers is that you have to find a reader that you trust. You have to write as if you're speaking to them directly. Don't lie to them. And that reader will become your compass. Now, there's also something that Stephen King points out is that writing is a very reclusive process. When he's writing, he's a very different person from the person who is, socializing. He does not go out in public when he's writing. It's very reminiscent to Murakami as well, who believes that writing is a private time of absolute focus. If you see Stephen King in interviews, if you see him in events, he's such a funny, such a sociable person who loves to tell stories and who loves to talk to people. However, he says he's very different when he's writing. He's very reclusive. Now, this whole process that I just talked about very briefly, of course, the reason why it succeeds is because it removes excuses. It's very much about discipline. It privileges momentum and spontaneity. It accepts imperfection, which is something that a lot of artists fear. And it also respects the reader very much. Stephen King never waited to feel like a writer to get to work. He always acts like one. He also acts as the reader of his books. And that is something that I remember Stan Lee, one of the creators of Marvel Comics. There was a time in his life where he was very miserable because he didn't enjoy anything he was writing, anything that people were asking him to write, because he was trying to cater, to the reader's needs, the market, the editors. So again, also he had a very supporting wife, and she once told him, write about what you would love to read. This will make it more enjoyable. So it makes a lot of sense. When you act as your own target audience sometimes, it makes you produce something that succeeds. Now I'm going to talk to you very briefly about some of the Stephen King books that I have read recently. I'm going to start with Salem's Lot, which Stephen King also refers to as the vampire book. So at the time where Stephen King wrote Salem's Lot, he was teaching at high school. He was teaching horror and fantasy writing. They were reading Dracula in class, Bram Stoker's Dracula. And he thought to himself that what an interesting book that was written in the 19th century, where science and technology triumphed over superstition. However, when he sat down to write Salem's Lot, he was thinking about our days and technology today and the pollution that it's causing, nuclear waste, atomic bombs. He thought to himself that he cannot use technology as a way to solve anything in his story. Nowadays, technology is actually ruining us in many ways. So he decided to write Salem's Lot, bouncing off Bram Stoker's Dracula. And he wanted to include vampires in his story as well. But he didn't want to use technology as a means to find solutions to a problem. Technology was in many ways doom, and a lot of the characters actually die in the story. Some lived, however, they lived alone, and they lived in a world that was actually getting gradually ruined. It was a very interesting read. I had a bit of trouble keeping up with the amount of characters. There was a lot of characters in this book, but you learn to get used to them. And you focus mainly on the main characters. Now I'm going to talk about a novel that I love very much, which is The Shining, and it's one of Stephen King's, of course, most famous novels. And I'm going to tell you that The Shining is actually one of Stephen King's most autobiographical novels, even though, it's dressed up as a ghost story. So on many occasions, King said that he was basically writing about himself when he was writing the character of Jack Torrance, who is the main character of the story. He was writing about himself at his worst, and that was the time where he was struggling with his addictions. Now you can say that The Shining is very successful, and it works because it works on two levels. It's a very good, a haunted hotel story, but it's also very deeply and very much about family, addiction, and inherited violence. The plot is very clear. It's not rushed. Jack Torrance is a former teacher who is a struggling but aspiring writer. He takes a job as a winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel in Colorado. It's a massive, isolated resort in the mountains of Colorado. The hotel closes for the winter, and there's no one except for Jack Torrance, who is now the caretaker, his wife Wendy, and their young son, Danny. So for a while they will be completely cut off from the outside world. Now the little boy Danny has a psychic ability. He has something called the shining, which they explain in the book. It's a kind of extrasensory perception that allows him to see visions from the future or the past. He can read emotions, he can sense danger. So because of this gift, he is able to feel immediately that there is something off, that there is something dangerous about the Overlook Hotel. Now the winter sets in and the snow will trap the family inside. This is where the hotel starts revealing violence from the past. And we start noticing how Jack, the father, starts getting increasingly unstable. The Overlook starts feeding on his anger, his weaknesses, his resentment, his pride, and even his struggle with alcoholism. So the hotel attempts to absorb the family and, repeat the cycle of violence and destruction. So at the core, the plot is very simple. You have a haunted place, you have a vulnerable man, you have isolation that's going to add to the mix, and you have a catastrophe that's bound to happen. The Overlook is used as a symbol of accumulated evil. So it's not just a haunted place, it's full of crime, it's full of those dangerous secrets that have always been kept hidden within. If we were to talk about symbolism, the hotel symbolizes past unresolved trauma, systems that preserve violence, and places that reward cruelty. So the hotel does not create violence, it preserves it. So it becomes like this museum of tragedies created by humans. And anyone who comes in becomes part of the collection. For example, in the novel, you have parts where Jack, the new caretaker, he has visions of the older caretaker who also went crazy and he killed his entire family. So they start having these conversations, and the old caretaker starts, pushing Jack to commit murders as well. Stephen King wrote Jack Torrance as a reflection of himself. Jack's demons, which were also Stephen King's demons at the time of his life, which were alcohol addiction, rage he could barely control, this desperate need to feel important and successful, and of course, the fear of becoming a failure. So the hotel, in a way, it does not possess Jack out of nowhere. It did not choose him at random. It chose him because it wanted to validate his bitterness. It also wanted to flatter his ego and encourage the worst of his impulses. So symbolically, you can also say that the Overlook is addiction itself. It isolates you, it lies to you, it even promises you control, but then it takes it away from you. Stephen King also says that Jack Torrance doesn't become a monster overnight. It happens gradually, and that's the real horror. Now Danny, the little boy, he's the symbol of awareness and vulnerability. The psychic ability that he has is often misunderstood as, just a horror gimmick. But symbolically, it represents emotional sensitivity, childhood intuition, and a child's ability to perceive something that adults deny. Much like children who grow up in abusive homes, they sense danger long before they can even name it or understand it. So the shining, this ability that Danny has, is described as a survivor tool, but it's also a burden. Now Wendy Torrance, Jack Torrance's wife, she is a symbol of quiet, of tenderness, and of survival as well. She's intelligent, she's very protective of her family, she's very protective of her son, and she's very emotionally perceptive. She represents endurance as well, which is a kind of strength that is not considered as, glamorous. However, it saves lives. Now, symbolically, Wendy stands for the price of loving someone who's unraveling and the very tough labor that is supposed to hold families together. She also represents this horror of watching someone you love become more and more dangerous, not only towards themselves, but to others as well. Isolation is a very important point in this novel. Physical isolation, being stuck in the mountains, in the snow, alone, isolated from the whole world. Emotional isolation, where Jack turns, against his own family. And of course, psychological isolation, denial, obsession, addiction. The hotel completely strips away routine, social accountability, and reality check altogether. Inheritance is also one of the novel's themes. For example, Jack Torrance was abused as a kid by his father, and then he had this fear of becoming his father. So the hotel mirrors this generational pattern. The Overlook wants repetition. It feeds on this cycle. You have these hurt people who hurt other people. So this makes The Shining less of a ghost story and more about the history of violence in a family. Now, you need to understand that the ending matters a lot in The Shining. And I will not say anything about it because imagine me spoiling The Shining or spoiling any of Stephen King's novels. But you need to understand that the ending is very important because it's largely about choice. So even under this supernatural pressure that exists in the story, you will understand that people are not helpless, that awareness matters very much, and that love and responsibility, they still exist. So despite this very supernatural, horrific situation, something human can still resist. So in short, if you were to summarize The Shining in one sentence, it's about a man who is slowly replaced by the worst version of himself and a family who is trying to survive this transformation. Stephen King said that after rereading the story after a while, he was very shocked by how clearly and how honestly it revealed his addiction. And that was before even consciously admitting it, which felt very eerie to him. He also explains that fear of losing his family is at the core of the story. In the novel, Jack Torrance's fear was not only, failing in his career or failing as a writer, but it was also hurting his wife, hurting his kid, losing his family, and of course becoming his father. And Stephen King himself talks openly about those times during his addiction where he would lose his temper and he would scare his children. And that made him realize how close he was to crossing the line. So yeah, The Shining is fueled by that fear. Now, as you may know, The Shining was adapted into a film in 1980 and it was directed by Stanley Kubrick. What's most interesting is that Stephen King's novel is very different from Kubrick's adaptation, and that King and Kubrick themselves are almost philosophically opposites. You have the same premise and completely different souls to the story. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the movie is very different from the book. So, in the novel, you have Jack Torrance. You understand right from the beginning that he is a flawed character. However, you can also see that he's a very loving father, and that he is trying to fight his alcoholism and his temper. The actual horror in the novel is watching him slowly lose this battle against his flaws. Now, in the movie, you feel right from the beginning that Jack is an unstable character. There's very little sense of a good man underneath. So in this case, the horror is actually realizing that he's initially a bad person. So the core difference here is that Stephen King shows you that people can actually fall, but in Kubrick's case, he shows you that people are already fallen. Now, when it comes to the hotel, in the movie, you feel that the hotel is a predator. However, in the novel, the hotel is more of a mirror to the main character. So in the novel, the hotel is actively evil. It has intentions, it has hunger, it has memories. In the film, the hotel is more ambiguous. It may be haunted, it may be psychological, you never know. And rather than causing the madness, it reflects it. Stephen King gives you a monster, but Stanley Kubrick gives you an echo chamber. There's also a difference when it comes to the character of Wendy Torrance, the wife and the mother. In the novel, Wendy is more decisive, she's capable, she's strong. She actively protects her son Danny, and she is able to think more clearly under pressure. In the film, Wendy is more nervous, she's more fragile, and you can feel her falling apart a bit more. She reacts to what happens more than actually act. And it's one of the main reasons why Stephen King actually dislikes the movie, is because Kubrick actually turns resilience that Wendy has into hysteria. She's hysteric most of the time. And when it comes to Danny's power, which is the Shining, in the novel, this ability is clear. It's explained. And Tony, as he calls his power, Tony becomes his protector. However, in the film, Danny's visions are very fragmented and they're not really explained. Tony feels a bit scary and eerie rather than helpful. So instead of being empowering, the Shining or the power, it becomes more disturbing. Stephen King treats psychic powers as sensitivity, but Kubrick treats it as alienation. Now, the structure and the pacing is also very different. The novel is a slow burn, it slowly escalates. There's a very heavy backstory about the hotel, and there's a clear cause and effect. In the film, there's a bit of a cold and detached pacing. There's, repetition of the horrific events, repetition, symmetry, and dread. Stephen King builds pressure, but Stanley Kubrick builds more unease. Now, of course, I'm not going to tell you anything about the ending, but I'm going to tell you that the ending is very different. Film and novel. In the novel, there's an emphasis on responsibility, sacrifice, consequences. It offers you a moral resolution. The film, it's more cynical and unresolved and very disturbing. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I've tried watching videos analyzing The Shining to be able to understand the ending of the film. I still can't understand what Stanley Kubrick was trying to say in the ending. It's very ambiguous. Now, the emotional temperature is very different in both the novel and the film. The novel is more warm, human, and painful. It's very invested in family bonds. It's very tragic. But in Kubrick's adaptation, it's very cynical, it's very cold, it's very distant. You feel the emotional alienation. And to be very honest with you, you don't feel the family bond at all. Maybe with Wendy and Danny, yes, but with Jack, you feel like he's not even the father. You feel like he's not even part of the family. You don't feel like there's a genuine family bond. That's why a lot of people find the movie to just be terrifying and not moving at all, which is very different from the novel, because the novel is very emotional, especially towards the end. Now, I'm going to tell you why Stephen King very famously despises the movie. There are some film adaptations that he liked, based on his novels. However, The Shining was a big no-no for him. I think it's very clear when he explains that he believes that Stanley Kubrick stripped the novel from its emotional core. He completely removed Jack's humanity and he just turned it into abstract madness. So in a way, Stanley Kubrick was not adapting the novel. He was just using, the story as material to create a very, a typical horror movie. Now I'm gonna redeem the movie by telling you that it is true that it wronged the novel, very much so. However, it's still very iconic. It's very iconic in its own way, and it's a movie that I enjoy watching very much. I remember the first time I watched it, I was still a student. I was in Japan, and it was Halloween night, and I decided to watch a horror classic, a classic movie. There was this DVD place next to my house. It's called Tsutaya, and it was such a lovely way, such an old-fashioned way of watching movies, and I loved it. You rent out DVDs, as many DVDs as you want, and you return them after a while. So it was Halloween night, and I decided to watch The Shining. I had not watched it ever, but I knew how iconic it was. It's such a famous movie. First time watching it was very disturbing. I'm going to be honest. It was very. I was on edge the whole time, especially with the soundtrack. The soundtrack was so powerful, especially with the very sharp sounds that you hear and the heartbeat. There are literally sequences where there's just a heartbeat throughout. But then I grew to like it. It grew on me because it's such a visual treat. Stanley Kubrick, his way of creating horror was very uniquely his. He literally goes the opposite direction when it comes to typical filmmaking. He just drains his movie from warmth and logic, and he just wants you to feel uneasy throughout. There are long silences, there are empty spaces and endless corridors. You feel like you are inside the hotel as you're watching it. He literally turns the hotel into a spatial nightmare. Every room, the bar room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, even the maze outside. No need for words, no dialogue required. You can just enjoy how visually pleasing it is, especially with the interiors and the way he films everything. You feel like the camera is a ghost itself, it glides. I love Jack Nicholson so much. He's one of my favorite actors, but some people said that he kind of exaggerated in his performance when he reached, the completely mad part. But it was intentional. This excess in the acting made it very theatrical, and he wanted to seem unnatural. He wanted to seem like, a guy who transformed into a monster. Shelley Duvall, the actress who played Wendy, the wife, she was amazing. I watched, any behind the scenes video that I could find. She was genuinely scared. She was genuinely tired and cold and emotionally drained. she was smoking a lot, and she was literally losing her hair from all the stress and the anxiety. And the director was not very kind to her, by the way. Like you can see behind the scenes shots of him actually yelling at her. I mean, some people say that it was intentional because he wanted to make her feel uneasy. He wanted to bring out the best of her, but it was not fair. It was not fair because Jack Nicholson was very comfortable and everyone was, fangirling over him. But Shelley was feeling she was feeling left out. No one really paid attention to her. She felt very vulnerable, very alone in the process. But I'm so, I feel very bad saying that it did work. Like, whatever she was feeling, it worked, because there are scenes where you feel like you want to cry, especially when she's up the stairs and she's swinging the bat in front of Jack and she's crying. You feel like she's so terrified. You feel like she's confused, as if the actor and the director were ganging up on her. She was feeling very vulnerable in that moment. I feel like they didn't really give her credit for this performance. But I love her so much, and she's an overall sweetheart. Like, if you watch any Shelley Duvall interview, you see how warm she is. Even in her moments with Danny, her son in the movie, she's such a mother figure. The way she holds his hand with both hands and the way she hugs him, she's such a warm person, and it was very obvious. And the kid was amazing, by the way. He grew up to be a university teacher. I think he teaches biology. You can find an interview with him on YouTube, and he talks, as an adult, he talks about his experience of filming The Shining. It was very interesting. So visually, the movie was so gorgeous, and there are a lot of elements that you might have seen here and there that were taken from The Shining that have become very iconic, like the patterns from the carpets or wallpapers, the scene with the two girl twins, the little girls in the hallway wearing their blue dresses, holding hands. It became very iconic, and as a lot of Stanley Kubrick's movies are, his movies are very, very gorgeous, and he has created a style that is very recognizable as his own. Like, sometimes you look at an interior or, a color scheme, and you would say that it's very much like Stanley Kubrick's style. I love that. So yeah, these elements and the movie altogether is burned in, cultural memory. That's cinematic power, to say the least. Now, if Stephen King's novel was about losing your humanity, Stanley Kubrick's film was discovering that there's no humanity to begin with, which is pure horror, and it was so brilliantly executed and shown in his film. Now, I'm gonna tell you that it's so ironic how I was preparing for this video, and one day, my friend sends me a message and tells me that they're showing The Shining at the AMC cinema. And I was so happy because, imagine experiencing The Shining on the big screen. I felt like I was back in the 1980s. It was so amazing. I watched it yesterday, actually. I watched it last night. I felt like I was watching it for the first time. I noticed new amazing details. It was very enjoyable. I'm very grateful that I got to watch it in the cinema. Now I'm going to tell you about the sequel to The Shining. I don't know if you knew this, but Stephen King actually wrote a sequel to The Shining, and it's called Dr. Sleep. While The Shining is about addiction and how it can destroy a family, Dr. Sleep is about what comes after that and if healing is possible. So, basic premise. Dr. Sleep follows Danny Torrance as an adult, aka Jack's little kid who has The Shining, and it's decades after the events that happened at the Overlook. Danny survived, but he did not come out of this untouched. And I will explain to you what I mean by that. He is now traumatized. He is struggling with alcoholism, just like his father. He is drifting from town to town, no stable job, no stable life, and he is using alcoholism to control or quiet down his ability. Now, the question at the heart of the story is, what happens to a psychic child, a child with this supernatural ability, when he grows up broken? Just like his father, Danny grows up fearing his own anger, deeply ashamed of his past. His shining is still there. It did not disappear. However, it is buried under the amount of drinking that he does. Eventually, Danny hits rock bottom and he decides to save himself. And so begins his recovery journey. He gets sober. He settles in a small town. He finds work in a hospice, and this is where he acquired his nickname, Dr. Sleep. Now, the reason why they nicknamed him Dr. Sleep is because of his shining, he is able to know when a patient is about to die. He would use his ability, the Shining, to comfort dying patients. He eases their fear at the moment of their death, and so he helps them, pass peacefully. So symbolically, we can say that Danny turned his traumatizing gift into a compassionate one. And what once made him feel vulnerable is now used to heal others. And of course, the novel has an antagonist or antagonists. It's a group called the True Knot. They are creatures that appear as humans. They live as nomads and they travel in packs. They feed on something they call the steam, which is the psychic energy that people who have the Shining pass on when they die. So their goal is to capture that steam so that they can become more powerful and they live eternally. So they extend their own lives by, feeding on pain. They mainly target children. Unlike the Overlook Hotel, they are very mobile. They can follow you everywhere. They are very predatory, and rather than representing possession, they actually represent exploitation, because all they do is just feed on people, killing people to gain something from them. Now there's a character, the main character whose name is Abra Stone, a little girl. She is the next generation in the story. Danny eventually meets Abra and he discovers her exceptionally powerful Shining. In contrast to Danny's fearful childhood, Abra is very assertive, she's very confident and very brave. Danny becomes her friend, her mentor, and her protector. He wants to keep her safe, he wants to help her understand her gift, and he wants to break the cycle of damage that is passed from generation to generation so far. So this mentorship becomes the emotional center of the story. The major themes in Dr. Sleep are, of course, addiction and recovery. In the story, Stephen King details this whole process of going to meetings, talking about your addiction, relapsing, the feeling of shame, community. It's in a way, also just like The Shining, it's a very personal story. Only this time, Stephen King was sober when he was writing it. Again, you have this theme of inheritance and choice. Danny is facing trauma, he is grappling with his psychic ability, he has inherited his father's addiction, but that does not mean that his fate has to be the same fate as his father's. So here you have this idea of choice. The novel insists on this idea that the past shapes you, it can shape you, however, it does not own you. Danny is a character who turns his pain into purpose. He does not erase his past, he uses it. His gift, which was once a source of terror to him, it becomes a gift that allows him to reduce suffering, to offer dignity, and to connect deeply with others. The tone of the novel is very different from The Shining. It's more tender, it's more soft. The Shining is very claustrophobic, it's very angry, and it's very terrifying all the time. Dr. Sleep is steadier, it's warmer, it's more reflective. So in one sentence, The Shining asks, what if a man destroys his family because he cannot face himself? And Dr. Sleep answers, what if the child survives and learns to live anyway? It's a very good book. I really enjoyed it. It felt very warm. It made me very emotional on many occasions. There's also there's a movie adaptation, and it's really good. There are some scenes that connect The Shining with Dr. Sleep, and if you watch them and if you understand the Easter eggs, you would feel very emotional. Now, finally, I'm going to talk to you about Stephen King's memoir, which is on writing. This is, I believe, one of the most important and enjoyable books I've read. And I think that if I had this aspiration to become a writer, if I was a writer to be, this book would be like a Bible to me. It was published in the year 2000, and it's about the craft of writing. It is not at all a theory-heavy writing book or a, poster for literary prestige. However, it is a personal life story. It's a working writer's toolbox, and it's, oddly enough, a demystification of talent. Stephen King literally treats writing as carpentry, as if it was carpentry. You learn your tools, you practice every day, and you don't overthink it. The story opens with him, of course, mentioning his childhood in Maine. He mentions his absent father. He talks about waiting for the bookmobile every summer. And of course, the rejection slips that he collected and that he nailed in front of his desk on the wall. These stories are so important because they show that writers are made through persistence and through hard work. And of course, it shows that reading a lot precedes writing, exactly just like Murakami would say. It also says that success is accidental, however, discipline is not. Discipline is something that you choose to have and that you work towards. Stephen King never presents himself as anything special, he just talks about himself as stubborn. And it's him being stubborn and determined that made him become a successful writer. Writing is not magic, writing is not mystical, writing is very hard work. Stephen King also believes that talent helps, of course, however, it's cheap. It's not everything. Consistency matters more than inspiration. Without consistency, you can't go anywhere with the inspiration that you have. And that you get better by doing instead of planning. There's this very interesting analogy that he gives in the book, which is, he talks about the writer's toolbox. He describes writing skills as tools that are stored in a box. In the top drawer, for example, you have grammar and vocabulary. In the middle drawer, you have style and sentence rhythm. And at the bottom drawer, you have story structure. You don't show off your tools, you just use them quietly. And of course, he talks about everything that I mentioned before about plot not being as important as starting with a situation, and that building good characters and seeing where your characters are gonna lead the story is the most important thing. So everything that I mentioned before, you can find it in this book. And of course, he talks about his addiction, his recovery, his accident. The chapter about dealing with the aftermath of the accident that he faced was very emotional, especially when he talks about the physical pain that he went through and how it took him a long time to recuperate and be able to sit on a chair again and simply write. What makes this memoir very special is that it respects beginners. It does not preach to anyone, it refuses mysticism. It treats writing like a craft that anyone can learn if they want to. And through his book on writing, Stephen King says that writing will not save you, however, it will give your life a shape if you show up every day. You would think that writing such a book would be easy, however, it was more difficult than even Stephen King thought it would be. When he finished it, he looked at it and compared it with his novel It, which is extremely thick. So he looked at it and how small it was, and he thought to himself, is this really all you have to say about the craft of writing? And apparently it was. So yeah, if you're an aspiring writer or you're interested in knowing how Stephen King works, how he writes, I think you would really enjoy this book. It's very interesting, it's very easy to read, and I'm gonna be very honest with you when I say I never thought I could laugh this much while reading a book. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about some of Stephen King's novels. Now I'm just gonna talk a little bit about his characters. A question that is also asked to Stephen King is, do you write characters that you like? He usually does. However, sometimes he also creates characters that he is very afraid of. Just like, looking back at the story that I told you about, where as a kid he was obsessed with the story of the serial killer and he wanted to understand him so that he can learn how to write about him. Stephen King also says that he especially likes to write about ordinary people in the best way he can. He is very interested in what happens when a very ordinary person is faced with something more powerful than them. Usually, literature is about extraordinary people in very ordinary circumstances. And yet, what he likes to do is write about very ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Now, besides his characters, what also makes Stephen King's writing very, his own, is the setting, which is usually the town of Maine, the town he grew up in. Stephen King says that he likes to write about something familiar. He always encourages aspiring writers to write about something that they know. And it is especially because he writes about fiction. He writes about something that does not exist. So having something very familiar to ground him is very important. It's very helpful. At some point in his life, he wanted to change scenery. He wanted to leave Maine for a while. He wanted to experience something new. He told his wife that he wants to live somewhere else for a while because he wants to try and write something different. So she asked him if he had a story in mind. He said no, not yet. And she asked him if he has a place in mind, and he also said no. So what he did was he took the map, he closed his eyes, and he pointed at a random spot on the map. What he got was Colorado, and so they moved to Colorado for a while. And The Shining is set in Colorado. So the setting is always inspired by something familiar that he has lived in for a while. Now, Stephen King was once asked a very important question, and his answer stuck with me. to be honest. I thought it was, I love the way he explained his answer. The question was, why do you think horror stories are appealing to readers? And Stephen King's answer was very quick, and he said that it's this idea of the forbidden that is very appealing. You tell someone, come with me and I'm gonna show you things that no one has ever dared to show you, and I'm gonna tell you things that no one has ever dared to tell you. And that is very attractive to people. And just like comedy, horror is very attractive. And so the follow-up question was, what is it that you do that is forbidden? And Stephen King gave his novel Pet Sematary as an example. It's the story of a grieving family, parents who have lost their young child. King follows them through the grieving process, and at some point, the father decides to dig up his son's grave and try and revive him again. As outrageous as the story sounds, King says that these things are only possible in fiction, and fiction is a lie. However, good fiction is when you have truth hidden inside the lie. So if you were to think about it logically, no one can do that. No one can go to a grave and dig up their loved one and try and revive them. This cannot happen. However, the reality is that this desire to bring a loved one back to life is true. So this is the truth that is hidden inside the lie that is this fictional story. And so horror fiction is the lure of the forbidden. Stephen King also admits that his writings are very reflective of his own fears. He jokingly says that writing is better than going to therapy, because if you go to therapy, you're just talking to a stranger and you're paying them to, help you. However, when you write, you can just write anything to as a form of therapy, and you get paid for it. Now, there's another question that is always asked to Stephen King, and it makes him laugh. They always tend to ask him, like, what was your childhood like? Because his stories are so disturbing sometimes. His topics are so outrageous that people are very curious to know what messed him up as a kid. And his honest answer is that nothing ever happened in his childhood that traumatized him. He had a very normal childhood, as he describes it. They also talk to him about the violence in his stories. He is asked if anyone can write darkness unless they have violence and darkness within them. Stephen King describes himself as a very nice fellow, a very normal person, a very good dad. He wanted to be the father that his father was never to him. And all this stuff on the dark side of his personality, they only come out in his stories. So in a way, the stories that he writes, they take away some of this pressure. If it weren't for his stories, it weren't for this ability to write them, to write his darkness away, he believes that he might have been a bad person. So violence, in a way, is a means to work things out to a lot of people. In his case, it's through writing, violence through writing only. Now, to end this episode, I thought I would compare Stephen King to Murakami because I thought they were such perfect opposite writers. And by comparing them, I think you can understand both even more. So in Stephen King's novels, you have a plot, you have a storyline, and stories, they move forward relentlessly. You have clear stakes, you have escalating danger, and you have a resolution in the end. His stories are very exciting, and this element of suspense is very important. As they say, Stephen King wants you to be turning pages at 2 a.m. However, when it comes to Murakami's writing, atmosphere comes first. Plot is often secondary. It is very fragmented. It is unresolved at times. His stories feel like something you're actually sinking into rather than, racing through. In his books, you feel like you're floating rather than running and racing. Another contrasting point, in Stephen King's writing, you have external horror that comes to you. However, in Murakami's novels, you have internal unease. In Stephen King's novels, the monsters are usually literal. They're usually a thing. You have evil clowns, you have rabid dogs, you have haunted hotels. Evil has a face, it has a name, and it has a history. In Murakami's novels, threat is unnamed, it's intangible, and very vague. Fear is something that comes from disconnection, emptiness, or, loss of self. The uncanny or the unnatural, it slips very quietly and it's unexplained. The third important point is community versus solitude. In Stephen King's novels, community is survival and isolation is danger. You have groups, families, friends, communities who are ready to fight back and to stand against darkness. Connection, shared memory, and a collective action is useful in order to defeat the monster. King's horror actually reflects this fear of being alone, especially alone with your worst thoughts. So, in other words, solitude is not peaceful. It's where addiction, trauma, and violence echo without interruption. In Murakami's stories, solitude is identity, and community is distance. In a way, Murakami reverses Stephen King's logic. Like I said in the previous video, solitude is not a problem. It's not something you want to resolve. It's a choice. His protagonists are mostly solitary. They are quiet, lonely, they are emotionally detached, and whatever they are facing is inward. They live on the margins of society and they are more observers than participants, to the point where community actually feels unreal or unreachable. Social structures, workplaces, family settings, they often feel hollow or even alienating. This sense of belonging is only an illusion, and it's very temporary. Now, the takeaway or the meaning behind the stories. With Stephen King, you have answers, you have resolutions, you have maybe morals. However, with Murakami, you have ambiguity. Stephen King usually explains the horror. You have endings where the central conflict has a resolution, and you have this moral universe where you have good versus evil, and good usually wins. Murakami refuses explanations. His endings are open and sometimes unresolved, and the meaning that the reader takes away in the end is personal rather than authorial. When it comes to genre, Stephen King embraces genre. He writes within genre traditions and he expands on them. However, Murakami blurs genre. He blurs realism with magical realism. He often resists clear categories. Actually, his writing is very eclectic. He uses genre elements without committing to genre rules. When it comes to the role of the reader, in Stephen King's novels, the reader is guided. You know when to be scared, you know when to feel sad, you know when to feel relieved. You expect tension that is building up, you expect things getting worse, and then you expect a resolution. However, in Murakami's novels, you have to interpret a bit more, you have to analyze, you have to question yourself a lot. So meaning is not something that is enforced on you, it's co-created. So it's what the writer gives you and how you complete what you receive. There's this analogy that I read that I loved very much. It says that Stephen King gives you a story and Murakami hands you a dream and walks away. And finally, the difference between their worldviews. King is humanist, he's compassionate, he's moral. Even in horror, he believes in decency and that fear and evil can be fought. Murakami is more existential, more detached. He's quietly melancholic. He tells us that loss is permanent and that some things cannot be fixed. However, they can be accepted. Two great writers, very different in their own ways. Now, a question that is asked to Stephen King as well that I found to be very interesting is that what makes a person love reading? Because he always talks about the importance of reading and always carrying a book everywhere and reading anything, especially if you want to become a writer. And so he is asked about what makes a person grow up loving books. That is something that he thought about when he was teaching students in high school. He noticed how the light just went out from the students' eyes, most of them, when he started talking about literature, and that no matter what he did, he could not bring the light back to their eyes, until the bell rang, of course. And so he realized that those kids, those young people must have grown in households where there were either no books or no one reading, and that those same people later, when they have their own homes and their own families, he assumed that they would also have homes with no books. Even when he was 23 years old, he saw this world of non-readers. So he tried to get through his students while he can. He wanted to show them, even convince them that reading is not only important because it will make you a better writer and then eventually get you a better job, but that reading is cool, it's a buzz, and it's plain old fun, as he says. Non-readers get to live one life only. It might be a good one, it might be a great one, but it's only one. However, readers get to live thousands of lives. So he wanted those kids that he was teaching to be open to this idea. And he does believe that when the right book falls into the right hands, it will light this fire that will lead you to the next book and the next book and the next. Stephen King actually met his wife Tabitha because of literature. They met when they were both students at the University of Maine. They were both working at the Fogler Library. He fell in love with her at a poetry seminar, and he fell in love with her poetry as well. They did not have much money. They lived in a pit-like apartment and a trailer. But despite their difficulties, they held on to their library cards. And when they had kids, they never forbade their children to watch television or anything like that. Stephen King actually calls the television the occasional babysitter. They also never forced them to read, despite the fact that they're both writers and they love books. However, those kids grew up in a home with shelves full of books. And they grew up with a mom and a dad who never went anywhere without a book in hand or tucked under their arm. Stephen King has this belief that teaching children is not necessarily about, laying down a bunch of rules and telling them what to do. However, it is more about just showing them examples existing in front of them, and they will learn by watching you. So the kids eventually grew up loving books. They even had pets named after famous authors or characters from books. Now, as parents, they also read to their kids every day. They didn't do it to, improve their minds in any way. It's just to amuse them, to keep them distracted, or keep them from ripping the house apart. King says that he became a connoisseur in Dr. Seuss books and Curious George, even Marvel comics. His son loved comic books. I found it funny the way he talked about one specific series of picture books in particular. He says that the absolute bane of my existence was Richard Scarry. Scarry is a last name. With these crowded and somehow unsettling pages of turtles, dogs, trucks, cats, driving red racing cars, bulldozers, serial killers, monsters beyond the rim of time. I have PTSD flashbacks to those days. 2 kids sitting on my lap, one with a leaky diaper, both wanting to know, where did the rabbit in this one go, Dad? He's talking about these books. It's adorable. By the way, I love these books very much as a kid as well. I had them, and even my bookmark now is from Richard Scarry picture book illustrations. And I love it so much. I love it so much that I don't want it to lose its colors, so I keep it in this plastic thing it came in. 2 of Stephen King's children became writers, his 2 sons. And so Stephen King believes that when you grow up with books, you grow up loving reading as well. It's natural. He also says that reading is very important, even crucial. He believes that the ability to think logically and clearly leads to good decision making in life, and that the ability to clear thinking comes from the ability to read. Now, last but not least, I want to talk about this very interesting question that is also asked to Stephen King often, and that is, what scares you? He always starts off by making a joke out of this question. He tries to, give a very witty answer, but eventually he gives a very honest answer. What scares Stephen King is not monsters, it's not ghosts, it's not gore, it's not jump scares. What scares him is the fragility of ordinary life. He talks about how scary it is that one small thing can end up destroying the stability of a life. For example, an accident, an illness, addiction, even one single bad decision that a person makes. Stephen King also talks a lot about this fear of losing the ability to control your own mind. This is very, very important to him because he did experience that by being addicted, to substances that made him lose control over himself. He's scared of breakdowns. He's scared of being overtaken by impulses that you can no longer control. He is also scared of the potential darkness that exists inside good people. He is very frightened by this idea that evil does not always have to come from the outside. Sometimes it's from within, it's from your life, it's from a parent, it's from someone who is, part of you. He's scared of death, decay, and our bodies failing us, aging, illness, time running out. But most importantly, he's very, very scared of this idea of children being in danger. Children are vulnerability, they are innocence, they represent memory. Once when he was asked what scares him the most, His answer was almost instantaneous. And he said that the idea that one of my kids would die. And that is the basis of his novel Pet Sematary. He describes himself as a control freak. So when his kids were young, they were with him all the time. He knew everything about them. He was able to keep them more safe than when they grew up. Because then they grew up and they left, they had their own lives. He could no longer have control over their safety. Even now that they're grown-ups and they have their own families, he still has this need to make sure that they are well, that they are safe all the time. But then again, he says that that's life, and no matter what's gonna happen, it's gonna happen, because you cannot bargain with God. Fear is very important to him as a writer. This is why he says in his memoir on writing that you should write about what scares you, not about what you think scares others. He argues that horror trends don't matter, that clever concepts don't matter. It is honesty that matters. When you truly and honestly write about something that deeply unsettles you, it will get through the reader. It will affect them. That's why his horror stories feel so intimate. And that's why they linger long after you will have turned the last page. So yeah, I think it's very interesting when he talks about his own fears and how he uses them in his art. And it also made me think about what I am mostly scared of in life. And it's a question that I want you to think about as well. Think about what scares you. It's very interesting. And that's it about Stephen King. So as of 2024, Stephen King has written 65 books. His books have been translated into more than 40 languages. 16 of his novels have been adapted to films, and I really recommend watching some of those because they are truly amazing. I recommend you watch The Green Mile. I recommend you watch The Shining. I recommend you watch Shawshank Redemption. I recommend you watch Secret Window. What else? And also Stand By Me, which I was very surprised to know that it was based on one of his books. One of the actors in the movie is River Phoenix. He is Joaquin Phoenix's brother. He was still a little kid, and sadly, this actor passed away when he was in his he was in his 20s, I think. He was very young, and the movie is amazing. It's about boyhood and boy friendships, and it's very, very sweet. Stephen King occupies a complicated yet, respected position in the literary world. It's a position that has increasingly evolved throughout his career. His early reputation was that he is a popular writer, but not a literary one. He was hugely popular, but he was often dismissed by critics. His work was usually labeled as pulp or commercial, but over time this critical opinion started to change. King's work reflected remarkable thematic consistency. He explores very important themes related to society or the human condition. His storytelling skill is paired with psychological and social depth. Today, it is common to see Stephen King compared to Charles Dickens for popularity and social insight, and Edgar Allan Poe for fear and psychology, and Mark Twain for voice and the Americana. Stephen King may not fit neatly into, the shelf of the literary elites. However, he reshaped what serious literature can look like. King believes that you can never reach critical acceptance, not in one lifetime, at least. He will, however, always keep trying to reach for it. But note that not to please critics, but to please the harshest critic, which is himself. And that's it. Now I'm gonna end with, I couldn't choose a quote because I have so many, but I'm just gonna read maybe three, I think. I just chose three. The first quote I chose was from Dr. Sleep, and it goes like this. There came a time where you realized that moving on was pointless, that you took yourself with you wherever you went. When I read this, it stuck with me because it could not be more true. When you are unwell, no matter where you are, no matter who you're with, no matter where you take yourself to change the mood, change the scenery, to get away from whatever is troubling you, it doesn't work because you are taking yourself wherever you go. It's terrifying and it's true. Another quote that I chose is from his memoir on writing, and Stephen King says that books are uniquely portable magic. I always think about this quote whenever I hold a book in my hands or when I pack a book with me wherever I want to go. It's like you're carrying comfort and escapism and adventures with you wherever you go. And the last quote that I chose is also from his memoir on writing, and it goes like this. Writing isn't about making money, getting famous, getting dates, getting laid, or making friends. In the end, it's about enriching the lives of those who will read your work and enriching your own life as well. It's about getting up, getting well, and getting over. Getting happy, okay? Getting happy. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to think about what scares you, and I will see you again soon, hopefully. Bye-bye!